Evening events. We're doing the same as we did last time, so trying to do a range of different talks on a Thursday night, some small, some larger, some very in-house, some a bit wider, so a real variety of people, and it's great to see so many people have joined us tonight. A bit of housekeeping: we're going to ask people to be on mute when they're not, unless you're actually speaking. We're using Slido or the chat function, and I know some people have already put some questions in, but please, after David's talked, I know he's going to be happy to answer questions. So by all means, start putting your questions in whenever you want. We've also set up a little poll because somebody had asked the question, what's your favourite tree? And I was just rather intrigued. I wanted to say what mine was anyway, but I was quite intrigued to see whether there were any sort of real favourites amongst the Fitzwilliam community. So if you fancy joining the poll, do so. David, I'm going to go to you now. David Coomes will be known to many people on this call. He's Professor of Forest Ecology and Conservation. And of course, he's a Fitz Fellow and our Fitz Fellow for Research in particular. You may have heard him on the Today programme before Christmas when he was being pretty questioning about the translocation of ecosystems. Tonight, he's focusing on trees and particularly on the English tree strategy that's championed by Lord Goldsmith, which commits the country to plant 30,000 hectares of new woodlands per year from 2025. If that happens, will it compensate for the loss of ancient woodlands? And I think some really basic questions: where would the trees be planted? How and which species would be chosen, and who on earth is going to pay for it? So that's just to kick off. But over to you, David. I think you've got some slides you want to share, but very much it's an informal session. Very much take it as you wish for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions.
Thank you very much. Can you see that slide? Does it work?
That's great. Thank you.
It's this sort of magic where I speak to myself in the little screen.
No, you'll be at the end.
Hope things are happening.
There will be lots of people.
So let me just get how do I get the slides? We've gone through them very quickly there. Hopefully I can get the slides moving forward smoothly. There we go. Anyway, so thank you very much for the invitation tonight. I've been involved in thinking about the tree planting strategy through a couple of committees, which are university committees and cross-university committees, which are aiming to produce sort of policy papers for government on this issue at the moment. So there's a couple which we're preparing. And I'm going to struggle a little bit. There we go. So there could be really major changes afoot to the way the countryside is managed. And one of the sort of visionary documents which have been written in recent years is this 25-year plan for the environment, which Michael Gove led. And essentially what he argues is that the subsidies to farmers public money should be used for public good. And we should be thinking now we've left the EU and we haven't got the common agricultural policy subsidies. How can we use that money better across our country? There's a new opportunity to spend that really large investment in agriculture every year. Can we use it to improve the environment? And then as a sort of follow on from that, the slide doesn't want to stop on Lord Goldsmith for some reason. And then we got Lord Goldsmith, who is in charge of this English tree strategy. And there was a consultation paper out last year, and the government is planning to plant 30,000 hectares of new woodland per year from 2025. Primarily, I think, for carbon storage, putting extra carbon storage, but for other things as well, which we'll come to. Now, 30,000 hectares, for those of you who don't know what a hectare is 300 square kilometers. So it's a huge amount of land which they want to find to plant trees every year. And people who are involved in Parliament might know a bit more about what's happening than me here, but yeah, on Tuesday there was this announcement. Here's the BBC saying that the bill, which all of this is a part of, has actually been postponed again because of the coronavirus pandemic and the problems of finding time in Parliament to do it. But it's essentially a very important bill for us to think about in the year ahead. Now, the basics is that Britain, the UK has extremely low woodland cover compared with almost all our European neighbours, and this has been noticed for a long time, about 12%, 13% woodland cover. And we're actually, just as an aside, we're sitting in, I think, the least wooded of all the counties in England, certainly one of the lowest, 3.5% wood. And just as an aside, this is Madingley Wood, just on to the west of Cambridge, and it belongs to the university. And this is how it was seen by the Luftwaffe in 1940, the photo on the left, the first aerial photo of the wood. There's been plenty since then. And on the right-hand side, you can just see in dark the woodlands across West Cambridgeshire. And they're few and far between. And what we know is that most of them were here in medieval times, and they were kept across the landscape because they were extremely valuable for people before the days of houses being made of bricks and metal being transported by roads. Having woodlands across the landscape, dotted across the landscape, was really valuable. And there's actually 42,000 of these little ancient woodlands scattered across the UK, and all pretty small, on average less than 5 hectares. But they're the sort of residual biodiversity of our ancient woodlands is still sitting in these sites across the country, but in a very dispersed way. So the new idea, or perhaps a reinvention of an old idea, is this thing called nature-based solutions. So this is using nature to meet societal challenges, to solve societal challenges. And there's interest particularly in woodlands for helping address the climate crisis. There's an equally important biodiversity crisis which doesn't hit the headlines around the world, and protecting woodlands could help that. And in the middle of that, there's these nature-based solutions which can actually, planting woodlands, which could be both good for biodiversity and climate if done right. And this is part of a sort of growing recognition that woodlands have economic and social value, which some of which isn't sort of pounds in the pocket. So here are some of the ecosystem services. So the first one, which I've got, is offsetting CO2 emissions, and you've got the Drax power station pumping CO2 into the atmosphere here, it's actually burning wood, which is interesting. We'll come back to that. But at the same time, planting trees could suck that CO2 out of the atmosphere again. Human well-being, nature in the top there. We've really come to appreciate nature, many of us, during the lockdowns, and perhaps never in recent years has been so much appreciation of nature. And of course, there's wood production, supplying power stations, but mostly framing houses and so forth, and things like flood relief. So there's a variety of things which woodlands are valuable for. But traditionally, the only sort of commercial value of woodland would have been timber production and things like human well-being. There isn't really a sort of economic value for that. So how can we create some sort of system by which the social values of woodlands are appreciated in planning? So this is an old idea. Here's a very famous report from a decade ago. David Reed, writing about the values of woodland for planting for climate change. I've got a few wordy slides. I apologise for that. I don't normally like wordy slides. But the UK currently stores 4 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So just take it from me, it's a lot of carbon stored in forests, a large word, and that's about 4.6% of the total amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere is being soaked up again by forest. Now that in itself isn't a very big number, is it? 4.6, but as a part of a plan of lots of different ways of soaking up CO2 going into the atmosphere, it could be important. The interesting next statistic is that the Office of National Statistics has come up with this what they call natural capital accounts, and they reckon the value of woodlands for storing carbon is 12 times the value of the wood production in those woodlands. That's a really amazing figure, but it's because people are understanding the tremendous existential risk of climate change, and every ton of CO2 we put into the atmosphere is actually going to cost us a lot. So there's a new equation coming in here that actually woodlands are very valuable for carbon storage across the world. And so if we do plant these extra 300 square kilometers of woodland every year from 2025, it could be beneficial in helping to combat climate change. So here's the sort of idea in a simple graph. We've got carbon emissions on the y-axis and years on the x-axis. And what the hope is that we'll decarbonize our economy. We promised to do that. We're committed to do that. And so that's the orange line, our fossil fuel combustion going down year upon year. But we will never be able to get rid of 100% of that, those emissions. And so if we invest in woodlands over time, that carbon sink, that drawdown from the atmosphere will get larger and larger. And by 2050, it actually could be quite a significant fraction of the offsetting the remaining carbon emissions from fossil fuels. And it's currently much cheaper than any of the engineering solutions that are being put forward, like burying CO2 under the oceans into aquifers and so forth. It's probably an order of magnitude cheaper than those solutions. I might skip that one, other than to say that there's been modelling done to try and work out exactly how much carbon storage would occur in the future if you come onto that. So that's carbon storage. So if we plant those trees, I'm sort of guessing at the number, but by 2050, maybe it's making up 20 or 30% of the offsetting 20 or 30% of the emissions, which could be a very significant amount. So biodiversity value, what I should have said when I showed you those ecosystem services earlier is that there's trade-offs which we need to think about. It's really hard to think how we can actually do things which are good for carbon storage, good for biodiversity, and good for timber production. That's the sort of win-win-win, which we'd all love. But unfortunately, there's trade-offs, and that's what makes this whole process complicated. So here we got a beautiful bluebell woodland, wonderful for nature and for human well-being. The committee, which is the independent committee which is advising on climate change, actually wants us to actively manage these woodlands and take some wood out of them and put that. I think the primary reason for that is for fuel wood for fires in houses and so forth. So to bring an economic value to the woodland. Now that isn't necessarily a terrible thing, but if we take out too many of the big trees, then we'll be losing a lot of the opportunities for biodiversity, particularly birds and bats and lichen. Lots of the biodiversity really needs those tall trees and also deadwood in woodlands. So if we harvest too much without proper legislation, there's a risk that we're going to really harm biodiversity. The second thing we can do with woodlands to enhance biodiversity is actually to connect up those ancient woodlands I showed you at the start, to really kind of build better networks for nature. And that sort of abstract picture on the right is showing that. And that actually is what Sir John Lawton's report said about 7 or 8 years ago. That's what we needed to do, to try and join up our existing small patches of nature together. And so if we were to plant native woodlands, then we could have a sort of win-win here, because they are actually good at storing carbon, can be better than conifer forests. They're really good for nature, and they could buffer and help our existing network of nature. I'm missing a few bits out to go a bit quicker. The third thing is we could, for what happens if we expand conifer plantations. So there's a huge lobby to plant conifers. There's an organisation called Confor whose job it is to lobby on behalf of the conifer industry. And traditionally, we know that plantations are really have been really bad for biodiversity and for scenic value. But there's a new plans afoot to sort of make plantations look much less bad across the countryside, and by coming up with careful spatial planning, minimise the impact of biodiversity. But there's certainly a discussion to be had here about how, if we're planting new plantations, how can we actually make them not unbeautiful, but also not terrible for biodiversity. And there is a forestry standard for that. Next question, where do we plant these wretched trees? 300 square kilometres of them. We're in quite a crowded country, aren't we? And so the obvious thing to think about is what sort of land we're going to take out of productivity if we're going to do that. So Cambridgeshire is mostly grade 1 or 2 agricultural land. It's really good for growing crops, and not much of the country is good for growing crops. You can see that on the map there. If we take that land out of productivity and turn it into woodland, firstly, it's going to be super expensive because the land's valuable, but also we're going to remove our production capacity for food. And unless we all go on diets and eat much less, what we'll have to do is import that food from somewhere else, probably from ultimately expanding agriculture in the tropics. And that is in no way beneficial for carbon. We're just offsetting our problems overseas if we do that. So we don't really want to plant grade 1, 2, or 3A land up for forests. At the bottom of that, and I'll come back to the middle one in a minute, is peatlands. If we plant forests on peatlands, where most of the plantations have been in recent years, in Scotland and so forth, actually the evidence now is that that's not very good for carbon drawdown, because we damage the peatlands and that releases carbon into the atmosphere. So it's not got much carbon benefit, although it's very cheap. In the middle, we have all this sort of rough, poor grazing land, so 3B, 4 and 5 as it's called, being used for raising cattle. Now this seems the best opportunity for planting these woodlands, because it's relatively cheap. It's not taking arable land out of productivity. But if that was to work, Friends of the Earth and others have argued, well, what we really need to do is eat less meat, because otherwise you just have the same problem. You're displacing the food production overseas to the Brazilian rainforests, which are being cleared for cattle grazing. So it's really difficult. We're in a sort of crowded island. If we're going to plant trees, we're creating new problems for ourselves unless we change our habits, what we eat, how much we waste. There's no really easy solution. But low productivity grasslands is almost certainly the best way forward, and there are plenty of those around to do this woodland planting. Finally, native species versus conifers. Well, this depends really on where we want our trade-offs between wanting to draw down carbon, protect biodiversity, and produce timber. And so there's a complicated argument going on about that at the moment. Maybe we can come to Drax in our question time. That's an interesting one. So this is my last slide. So this is my take on it. Establishing native woodlands in places which are overgrazed, species poor grasslands, that's the best place to do it. We also want to plant woodlands near towns, because but in smaller amounts, but that gives us the societal benefits. And along riversides, there's various benefits to doing that. And so we can actually, that can be good for biodiversity, for carbon, and for people. But if we're doing all this planting, we've got to sort of meet these 4 high-level principles. The first one is that we absolutely mustn't take the eye off the ball of decarbonising the economy. This is what Greta Thunberg has been getting cross about with Donald Trump 2 years ago, you might remember. We really mustn't use this as an excuse not to decarbonise. And we've got to work. We've got to work to try and encompass sustainable management of ecosystems. We've always got to involve local people to make this work, and we've got to think of how we're going to benefit biodiversity. So it's an exciting moment. Times of change. There's a lot to think about to get this working properly.
Thank you very much indeed, David. We'll get everybody back, and I'll get chat on as well. Can I kick off with a very straightforward question? Perhaps not so straightforward, I don't know. You kept saying we, and who is the we in terms of what's the plan for how these 30,000 hectares are going to be developed? Who's the we? I mean, is it the Forestry Commission still, or has there been any thought yet about where's the directing mind or organisation on all of this? Because if we're just all told to go out and plant a tree, that won't be very effective, presumably. So
no, that's right. So it's going to be somehow funded through the changes in the replacement for the Common Agricultural Policy. Right. So Lord Goldsmith there's a promise of £640 million for tree planting, but which sounds a tremendous amount, doesn't it? But it isn't when you think of the opportunity costs for farmers and landowners over the long term of taking their land out of agricultural productivity. And so, and it's a tiny number compared with what the subsidies are through the Common Agricultural Policy. So in itself, it won't be enough money, but it will have to come through subsidies. Instead of, you remember in the olden days, the farmers just got a set amount for running their farm, and then it was much more environmentally focused in recent years. So it would be that's a lever that persuading landowners it was in their economic and social and wider social interest to plant trees.
I see, and run from DEFRA or whoever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, that's a good question. I'm not too. I think through DEFRA. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So the Forestry Commission, obviously, the UK has, Scotland's got a large amount of government land. Britain less. I think don't know how much Wales has got. So there is government land still for planting, but primarily this would go through landowners.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go on to some of the questions we've had. From Tom, would you agree that the current protection framework for ancient woodland prioritises beetles and lichen in preference to actual trees?
That's an interesting one. So I think the ancient woodland, obviously somebody knows this. Somebody knows this very well already. There is an encouragement for a sort of active management of our ancient woodlands. So not just leaving them for the trees to grow tall. And the reason for that is that cracking open the canopy and letting light come through to the ground level is actually very beneficial for many of the organisms which live on the ground. But there's certainly a trade-off to be had between if you take out too many of the trees, those wonderful tall trees are providing lots of habitats for birds and specialist bats and lichens and stuff. I'm not too sure about the beetle question. Maybe somebody can elaborate on the beetles.
Tom, do you want to elaborate on your question?
Yes. I own a woodland which is part of a special area of conservation.
Yeah.
And dealing with what I think now is natural England.
Yeah.
They make it extremely difficult to do anything with the woodland in terms of conservation. And so naturally it's become minimal intervention and natural high forest. Yeah. And as a result, there's zero natural regeneration of trees, which are oak and hornbeam, yet it's a paradise for beetles, bryophytes, lichen, etc. And natural England seem to show very little interest in the trees and whether or not they're going to be around in 50 years' time, but get really excited about what's on the ground.
Interesting. Yes. I mean, I do know the process. I can sympathise with you finding the process difficult of discussions with natural England. The Madingley wood on the top of the hill is an SSSI, so it's a highly protected woodland, and it only gets more complicated when they fall into that category.
David, there's been a few questions on peatlands. Let me find one of them. How would you compare the benefit of new woodlands against the re-wetting of peatlands, e.g. in the fens, on CO2 and other grounds? And let me just add to that, because a few people have asked about this. It's okay to have woodlands as a carbon sink, but at some point those trees die or are harvested, so carbon isn't locked in forever. Question, is that the graph you skipped over? Any comments on that?
Well, that's an interesting one. If you do have sort of succession of native forests without harvesting, and they do carry on accumulating carbon for hundreds of years. We got some evidence of this actually from the eastern border of the United States, where the forests were cleared in the late 18th and early 19th century and then abandoned, and people moved west. And those forests are still accumulating large amounts of carbon today, well over 150 years later. So it's there's a sort of thought that the amount of carbon stored in forest levels off, but the evidence is actually that it carries on slowly going up over time. So the old ancient woodlands can be very valuable, continuing carbon accumulation. But if you harvest trees, then you're taking the carbon out again. One of the interesting facts is how much carbon stored in the soils. You think of it all stored in the trees, but the majority of it is actually stored in the soils of the forest. So that's to do with that one. The fenlands. That sounds like you're getting me into tremendously hot water, asking me any questions about the fenlands. Maybe I could address the Scottish peatlands, the sort of Highland peatlands.
Yes, the Highlands.
Because that's perhaps less controversial, because maybe it's just because I'm several hundred miles away from them. But what is known for the Scottish Highlands is that if you want to plant trees, you've got to semi-drain the peat to create aerobic conditions underground for the roots to grow in. And if you do that, then actually the peat just starts oxidizing away, and you just lose the peat. So you get tremendous amounts of CO2 going into the atmosphere. And so the growth of the trees, which are accumulating carbon, is completely offset by the loss of CO2 into the atmosphere through peat degradation. So actually new forest planting is completely banned on deep peat in Scotland now. But there's a very lively debate going on about whether even on the shallower peats they should allow any plantations to happen. There was a paper out recently saying no, you shouldn't even plant. A couple of papers saying you shouldn't plant out even on the shallower peats. That's not going to be a carbon benefit.
Okay, thank you. Can I go on to another topic which several people have raised, which is about the coastlines? Ellie, are you there? Do you want to ask your question? Because yours is a sort of broader version of a question that various people have asked.
Yeah, sorry, I know that I'm fighting for wetlands, so I apologise.
No, that's okay. That's fine.
Ellie, huh?
Yeah, so I guess my question really is sort of, why is the government putting so much effort into restoring woodlands when there are alternatives, particularly as the UK has such low woodland cover, but we have a lot more coastline?
I mean, I think it's a good point. I'm afraid I can't speak for the government, so I don't know the answer to that one. I mean, the language they use is nature-based solutions, plural. So coastal ecosystems as well. I think, as you know, that probably the sort of evidence base for carbon sequestration in carbon drawdown in the coastal systems is less good than woodlands, and perhaps there's a reluctance based on that lack of, or not lack of evidence, but less evidence for those systems. I'm guessing. Sorry, I'm not. I don't know what goes on in the mind of Lord Goldsmith, I'm afraid.
That's okay. Well, the more time you spend with him, you might. Somebody asked, and I can't find the question now, but I wrote it down because I thought it was very pertinent. When you talked about when you decided what you were going to do for your talk, you talked about trees, and the first questions were about trees, but then immediately you switch into talking about woodlands. Why is that?
Oh, I don't know. Trees versus woodlands. So yeah, so woodlands are woodlands are collections of trees and shrubs as well. And I was there was a sort of round table meeting with Lord Goldsmith on Monday, which I was a part of, and it was all about how much we should be planting and how much we should allow natural colonization of the landscapes by just plant trees seeding themselves into the landscapes. And there's a huge movement. There's the book on. Oh, here it is, right on my desk. I keep meaning to read it. This is what's called the NEPA state, where a rewilding, the landowner has let it go back to nature, and lots of grazing animals and pigs and things sort of disturbing the natural system, but it's a sort of a woodland. It's a shrubby woodland. It's definitely not a forest. And so there is a consideration of those sort of somewhat messy systems, actually, and perhaps not visually very pleasing, but actually fantastic for biodiversity. And there's all sorts of rare animals coming back to that system. So yeah, woodlands is a catch-all term, including shrublands, including, yeah.
Actually, Matthew, let me pick you up, take that a bit further, because Matthew Harris asked, would woodland planting as a nature-based solution be more effective if directly integrated with rewilding policies?
Brilliant. Well, there's certainly a lobby.
For instance, species that could have lived in medieval woodlands, he adds.
There's certainly a lobby making that argument,
Right.
and there's Rewilding Britain has argued that farmers should be given a flat rate for rewilding, and nothing to do with trying to keep track of the carbon or anything. They just get a certain amount every year for their land if they allow it to rewild. So that's just costing the taxpayer money to give to a farmer to take their land out of agriculture. Well, that actually still is into agriculture, but they're getting money for rearing cattle and pigs in a sort of rewilding context. But I mean, the results are spectacular with rewilding in terms of nature. It's just remarkable what's been achieved in these rewilding projects. So it's a very exciting way forward. Hopefully it'll be part of the mix, but I can't see the government's going to invest everything in rewilding.
No, thank you. A question about transport routes. Where a new, or indeed an old transport route crosses through an area of woodland, how good a solution are green bridges for keeping biodiversity connected?
I don't know. There's some famous examples in Singapore, aren't there, where people have done that, but I actually don't know the evidence base for that. I'm sorry. It's a good question.
That's fine. And actually, I found the wood and trees person. It was David Norman. David, are you there? Do you want to add to what we were asking about trees and woodlands, because you've got real experience of it, David?
Yes, I am here, and thank you very much, Master. I live in Cheshire and have the honour to be currently Vice President of Cheshire Wildlife Trust. I was chairman for 8 years before that, so I've had quite a bit to do with this sort of thing. Cheshire is a very sparsely wooded county. I actually thought it was the most, but you say it's Cambridgeshire. Let's not argue.
You might be right.
There are two very large Forestry Commission plantations in the county of Cheshire, but other than that, almost all of the trees in our county are hedgerow trees, field trees, in a mostly pastoral landscape. And I wonder, I mean, it's a really, I appreciate that there are some species, particularly on biodiversity, some species which will only get in woods, but actually a lot of the other things to do with carbon capture and things like that. I mean, is there a real difference between woodlands and trees?
Yes, that's a good question. And I think the government is thinking all the way through, from individual trees to agroforestry, where trees are planted in sort of fields, through to hedgerows. So I don't think they're drawing that distinction. So the newfangled word is treescapes. I don't know if you've heard of treescapes, which embraces all of these different types of woody systems. Yeah. So I don't think they're drawing that distinction. And indeed, there's quite a bit of conversation about we don't want to lose grade 1-2 arable land, but there's always on every farm little bits of corners of fields which could go to woodlands. Obviously, as you're involved in the Wildlife Trust, the thing we obviously don't want to lose is the species-rich grasslands, which are much more endangered than woodlands nationally. So we must make sure they're not planted over. But looking for sort of corners in fields, steep, stony bits where woodlands could be planted is part of the thinking, I think.
Thank you.
Is Laura Sutcliffe there? Laura, you've got an interesting question about sort of post-CAP.
Oh my word, Laura.
Oh yeah, they're all here, David.
Hi, David.
Hello, Laura. I haven't seen you in about a decade.
That's probably about right, yeah. Yeah, so I work in the agriculture sector or agricultural biodiversity conservation, and I'm really interested to see what happens after the end of the CAP in the UK. However, my question is more or less similar to the previous one. Shouldn't we be promoting some kind of agroforestry integration of trees in agricultural land, if this is money going to farmers, rather than trying to afforest agricultural land?
Yeah. I know it's part of the mix, Laura, of the thinking. So, but I guess what I don't know is how it's all going to pan out. But it's certainly being discussed at the moment. And if you send me an email, I'll link you through to. You might have overlapped with him. Will Simonson is now. Was he around when you were around? I can't remember. Anyway, he is now working doing science in agroforestry in the UK for the Organic Association. So I can give you get in touch, and I can give you a link there, and he'll be able to tell you more about what the status is of that.
Okay, thank you.
Nice to see you.
David, we've had a question about community involvement. Where does community involvement fit in the government's current reforesting plans, or is it not there yet? Or how could it be there?
Well, I'm afraid I can't speak for the government.
No, we're not asking you to speak for the government. What do you think?
But there's plenty of wonderful initiatives, rewilding initiatives, which have really captured people's imaginations, and probably about 30 or 40 sort of flagship projects around the country where people are involved in planting trees and managing these rewilding landscapes, and they capture the public imagination. So I think we just need more of those, eh? That'll be wonderful. That's a win-win.
And
I should say the Wildlife Trust, as we've got somebody involved in the Wildlife Trust, do a fantastic job in this front already, in sort of involving people in land management.
Closer to home, what should we be doing in Fitz? Is there anything we should be doing actively? I mean, obviously we take our trees very seriously at all, but is there anything we should be doing more positively, either in terms of tree planting or in terms of education in the broader sense about all of this, I suppose?
Oh, good question.
I'm getting you to talk to us very regularly, presumably. But
well, I live in Coton on the edge of town, and you may or may not know that the reason is I live in a sort of a lovely green area is because the land was bought by a Trinity Don almost a century ago at Trevelyan for the purposes of keeping the whole area from development. And actually this land is rented out to a farmer at the moment. So I would love to, and it's mostly intensive agriculture with more nature than the typical high intensity farm, but still pretty well a sort of agricultural landscape. I'd be very interested in exploring ways of creating some more woodland on the western side of Cambridge. Yes. Which would be for the benefit of all the people in Eddington and Fitzwilliam and Churchill and so forth. Something lovely on the outskirts of Cambridge would be something I'm passionate about. But there's an opportunity cost there to the rental income lost if woodlands were planted. And the good thing about the subsidy scheme at the moment is it's not in any way profitable to take arable land out of production and turn it into woodlands, because I don't think we really want to do that. And if we want to feed the world, taking our best land out of production isn't a great idea.
Yeah, understood. And we've had a couple of questions about you mentioned the sort of wider use of trees. How can trees be used for flood relief? How does that happen? And can that even happen in the fens?
The fens, you mentioned the fens again.
Yeah, we keep coming back to it.
I've had lots of very interesting discussions this week about the fens. That's why I'm slightly smiling. Because the fens are a really huge emitter of CO2 across the county of Cambridgeshire. It's a really large amount, and DEFRA's putting up the suggestion at the moment that the fens should be rebutted, and of course it's a really nice bit of arable land. So there's this tension between carbon mitigation and farming in the fens. Flooding relief is actually quite controversial. It's not something I'm an expert on, but there has been reviews on it after the major floods. So the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology did a systematic review, and I think the evidence is for relatively small plantings of trees, there isn't a very strong effect on the maximum water flows through rivers if you plant small scale. But if you go to where there's very large amounts of woodland, there is good evidence that they do help in flood relief. And essentially it's just slowing, well, there's two things. The water permeates better into the ground under a woodland, and then it's slower to get to the rivers. And really what you want to do is just slow down the flow of water into the rivers after very heavy rain. And actually trees are much better at transpiring, taking water out of the soil through their leaves and into the atmosphere again than grass or solid tarmac, and that reduces the amount of rain getting into the rivers. So for those two reasons, you would expect effect, but I think small scale plantings, there isn't much evidence that in itself is beneficial for flood, majorly beneficial for flood relief. And that's my memory.
And is the government strategy, because this has come up in various ways through various questions, is the government strategy all about carbon and climate change, or is it also about biodiversity and, for example, mitigation of flooding or whatever, or is the focus completely on climate change?
So certainly the conversation is nature-based solutions plural. Who knows when push comes to shove? There's obviously an opportunity to offset carbon with woodlands. Not a very quick opportunity, I have to say. If you plant woodlands, it's going to be 2050, 2060 before those woodlands really get into gear to deliver soaking up carbon. But they're certainly talking about broader objectives. And the Forestry Commission, traditionally very focused on Sitka spruce plantations, is also seems to be, there's a new generation of people there very on board with delivering more than just timber. Okay. So I think the signs are good if you're into nature conservation like myself.
Yeah. What sounds like a straightforward question may not be, I don't know. Could hedgerows be allowed to grow into trees?
Yes. Well, actually, it's amazing on the Coton land where that's happened. I mean, they're small trees, things like hawthorns, but they're amazing for the birds in the winter. If you let them produce lots of juicy berries, then there's all sorts of lovely thrushes and other birds all feeding there in the winter. So it's certainly good for birds if you let them grow up a bit.
And COVID has obviously changed lots, and we keep being told that if it's not good for the environment, it's at least good that we are all rediscovering the environment, maybe, or thinking about it. But is that going to delay the tree strategy?
I mean, the tree strategy isn't going to be cheap because you're having to subsidise landowners to change their ways, and so the massive hole in our public finances, I'm not too sure how that's going to all play out, I'm afraid. But I guess there's ultimately some very, very tough decisions the government's got to make about how it's going to spend taxpayers' money over the coming years.
I've got a couple on HS2 and translocation, which I'll come to in a second. Is Robert May, do you want to ask your question about DRAX?
Yeah, just unmuting myself. Okay. Yes, I happen to know that Drax Power Station uses pelleted fuel from Canada, which seems to be very non-eco-friendly. We should be using UK wood pellets, I would have thought, but how can we make that happen?
Very good point. So the problem with wood biofuels is that actually plants are really inefficient at converting sunshine energy into usable energy. They're approximately 1% efficient, so for 100 joules of solar energy, you get about 1% turned into a usable product, whereas a solar panel is 20% or more, and so you need actually 20 times more land, or actually 100 times more land to get the same amount of energy from planting woodlands as you would from a solar panel, and David Mackay was very hot on this a decade ago, that if you look at how much woodland we need across the UK just to fuel up the Drax power station, it's the entire wood production of the UK would be drip fed into the Drax power station. So unfortunately, people got excited. I think it was a big mistake to invest in this sustainable fuel, because it's not really very sustainable on a number of fronts. And I think the Europeans are moving away from using wood in these reactors. I know they are. That they see the problem now. Yeah, and the real problem with importing from other countries is there's a loophole in the carbon accounting. So what's happening is that there's an assumption that it's carbon neutral, the harvesting of the trees overseas. So it's done sustainably, but in fact, often they're harvesting trees and reducing the carbon in the forest overseas, and nobody's keeping an account of that. So there's a sort of trick in the international accounting, which is troublesome. There's a really good set of papers by Chatham House about the biofuels, if you're interested in setting out the problems.
Okay, thank you.
That's been the wrong turn on most accounts, I would have thought.
Yeah. David Wright, do you want to ask, you've got a rather more detailed question on hedges or comment on hedges?
Okay, hi. Yes, I was just commenting here that if you leave a hedge and let it just branch out naturally, the branches eventually reach the ground and start regrowing, and you finish up getting almost a tunnel on a sort of double hedge. And I was suggesting this might be, if you're looking for natural ways to link up the ancient forest parcels, making use of some existing hedges and letting them stay uncut and grow wider and wilder might be a fairly slow but rather effective way to do it.
Yes, you certainly see blackthorn hedges. They come up in the neighbouring grasslands quite nicely, don't they? Yeah, it'll be interesting. There's almost, David Norman would know more about this than me, I imagine. There must be a good literature and examples on the benefits of doing that. I can see some merits in that, but also some problems. One of the things you get with the blackthorn, the sloes, is that they form these dense thickets which actually seem to impede regeneration of anything else, and the herbivores go along underneath them, sort of chew out all the other plants trying to regenerate, and so you just get stuck with this sort of blocked regeneration. I've seen that happening around the country.
But you do get an archway through the middle, which might be
used
for migrating mammals, for example.
I don't know whether it'd be interesting just to find whether there's examples of that. Normally there's enough hedgerows around the country where there might be hundreds where that's happened, and you could actually go and do some measurements and see what the benefits are of that course of action.
Rachel Webb, because you're back with the peat and a bit more detail on it. Floodplains are being carbon sinks. Do you want to go back to David on that, because we've sort of touched on that a couple of times, but why don't you make your point?
Yeah, I'm involved in a project at the Open University with floodplain meadows, and they are wonderful carbon sinks amongst other things. And I just wondered how the efficiency of floodplain meadows as carbon sinks compares to woodland. And I've seen a couple of suggestions that maybe we could plant trees on the floodplains, and so I'm I'm panicking here. I just wondered what your view was.
Well, yes, Ellie Wilding was asking questions, a PhD student with us earlier about that was coastal systems, but it's a sort of same principle.
Yes, it is.
The thing we obviously really mustn't lose is these beautiful, diverse floodplain meadows. That would be a complete disaster if people are allowed to plant up those. But I think there's a recognition that that's widely acknowledged as something we want to avoid happening. You see a lot about and the wild. So I think the Woodland Trust and the Rivers Trust have responded in a joint statement to the English tree strategy. And that was very interesting. They weren't pushing for huge amounts of new planting, but more targeted planting along streams, which keeps the water cool, which has got some benefits, and buffering the ancient woodlands. That's what they were recommending in their feedback to the consultation. So I agree, Rachel. I'm afraid I don't know the numbers about how planting woodlands would compare with meadows. There is the British Ecological Society is coming up with a book within the next 3 or 4 months, which will have that information in it. So keep your ears to the ground.
Lovely, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And coming to there's been a few questions particularly around translocation relating to HS2. So can we hear a bit more about it? Because we heard your Today programme. Can we hear a bit more about it? And is it all bad? Tell us a bit more about your thoughts on that.
Well, what happened there is that the BBC phoned me up because they didn't feel they could phone up the wild, and who was it they were going to phone up? The Woodland Trust. But they were, I think several members of the Woodland Trust were chaining themselves to the ancient woodland at the time, and the BBC wanted to have an impartial a person to speak about this issue. But of course, yeah. So the idea of just sort of breaking up small bits of an ancient woodland and putting them somewhere else, and some of it will take, but the thought that is actually sort of, creating something comparable to the ancient woodland, I think is clearly problematic, and that's the sort of point I made. It wasn't a particularly academic or difficult point to make. I think anybody who's seen the destruction of an ancient woodland and then a few stumps of trees and herbs thrown in another area nearby, and thinking that is a substitute for the ancient woodland would feel the same as me.
Understood. And can you tell us a bit more, as we sort of near the end really, can you just give us a feel of when we're going to hear more on the next stage of the development of the strategy? So due to start, you said 2030, did you say it was starting? But what's the sort of, we've got the environment bill presumably coming through, will that feature this in detail?
I think it's going to be in there, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. It's all going to be a part of that. So they're wanting to get going with the woodland planting ASAP. There's a sort of, quoting a Chinese proverb, Lord Goldsmith in the sort of preface of the consultation paper, saying the best time to plant a tree was a decade ago, and the second best time is now, or something. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something like that. And if they really do want it to have, the government wants to have it, trees mitigating, offsetting climate change, then they've got to get them in the ground quickly if that's going to happen. But it's going to take a huge effort to scale up even growing seedlings up, and all of that stuff is it can't be done overnight. It's going to be a huge amount of effort to do that. So I don't think it would be tremendously quick, and we don't really want to import things from Europe. And
no, it wouldn't help, would it? And
there might be a form to fill in.
in your conversations with Zach Goldsmith, do you get a feel? I mean, is it going to be features? Is it going to be something we're going to be pushing in COP26 in terms of being a sort of good example of what can be done in other countries?
I wouldn't like to say that I had an intimate and long conversation with Lord Goldsmith. I was invited for a particular discussion for an hour, but that is certainly my understanding, or it was my understanding, that this would be something which would be a key feature of the COP26, showcasing what Britain can do. But I heard recently they're much more. There might be, this is all the rumour mill, that they might be much more interested in getting carbon into agricultural land, which is something Prince Charles has been talking about for a while. So a lot of clay soils have virtually no carbon in it, and just by various management techniques you can get more carbon in the agricultural soils. So that's an alternative way of getting carbon into the Britain's into the English countryside,
or additional, I guess. Yeah,
I mean, that's right.
Final question, David, what is your favorite tree?
Shoria Bergentiana, and I work, which is a tropical tree, and I only like it because I work with airborne laser scanning, and a few years ago we flew over somewhere in Malaysia with a laser scanner, and we found what was then the biggest tree ever discovered in the tropics. And so I don't have very many brushes with the newspapers and all that, but I was briefly famous for about a week then because we found this massive tree. which subsequently fell over. It was very sad. About 3 years, 3 years afterwards, we went. There was an expedition to find it because it was in the middle of nowhere. And I didn't go, and there's photos taken of that. But then it died. But there's a subsequently about 50 even taller trees were found, just under 90 meters tall. So.
And in terms of a tree planting strategy here, what would your favourite tree be? What do you think we ought to be? What would you?
Well, it's got to be oak, hasn't it? You've got to have.
That's what I mean. If you look at our poll, oak is the big one. I have to say. I mean, we're pretty British. We're pretty sort of deciduous. You'll be pleased with the list, I think. Oak, beech, ash, silver birch is there, and then the others are smaller. But oaks come out very strongly. Yeah,
it's a good plan.
Yeah. Oh, Nicholas put the link there for. Is that for David's tree? That's for David's tree. We'll share that with people. We'll share that with people afterwards. David, thank you very much indeed. That was really interesting. It was great to see such a range of people joining us tonight, actually, from people you've known in the past as well as currently. So
yes, it was a pleasure. It was nice to talk.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Bye everybody. And we'll be doing these every Thursday from now on. So keep looking on the website because we're trying to get a variety of different talks. So really good to see everybody. Thank you. Good night.